Hello, and welcome to the Life in the Office radio show. Today we will be featuring Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, which is President John F. Kennedy's wife. We will be talking about everything Kennedy has done, but through Mrs. Kennedy's eyes. Now, let's welcome Jacqueline Kennedy.
Hello. Well, I am so happy to be here and very delighted that you invited me.
Well, anything for the First Lady of the United States. To start off, let's talk a little about your background. Would you mind?
All right. I was born on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York. I was a very good horse rider when I was younger. It's basically all I like to do. I was a very smart youngster. I loved to read. School came very easy for me, but every once in a while I would screw off and get sent to the headmistress for disrupting the class. When my parents divorced, I became even quieter than I already was and just started to keep my feelings and thoughts to myself. I started my first job as a photographer for the Washington Times Herald newspaper. During this time, I met my husband, John Kennedy. He was just a congressman who was soon to be elected for senator of Massachusetts. On September 12, 1953, we married at St. Mary's Church. We had a beautiful wedding and honeymoon.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Now, let's start with how Kennedy's new frontier has been going in your eyes.
I believe my husband was a very hard worker when he started out. It was a very hard road to his presidency, and he knew what he thought was good for America. Sometimes America wasn't on board with what he wanted, but can you give a baby a sharp knife if they scream and cry, saying that they want it? We were both certain that we wanted to make a change, so we made the White House more like a Camelot, beautiful and fun. We made many parties, which many people came. Early in his arrival to the White House, he started with the new frontier. He wanted to focus more on the poverty, space program, and the economy in America. He started cutting taxes. John put in $13.5 billion cut in taxes over a span of 3 years. Like a lot of his proposals, the tax cut stood a little chance of passage. Even though the tax-cutting proposal didn't go through, he did succeed in getting Alan Shepard into space in 1961. I was so proud of John. I knew he could do something magnificent as president. But in the following years, as you may know, my husband and I went to Texas to mobilize support on November 22nd, 1963. We were riding in an open car when the shots rang out. I can still remember to this day his breath shortening every second until there was no longer a sound coming from his body. On his way to the hospital, he died. He was the love of my life, and I am so glad that I got to spend more than 10 years of my life with him. He was an amazing husband, father, and 35th President of the United States.
I am so sorry about President Kennedy. But thank you so much for seeing me today. I really appreciate it, and I bet everyone in America loves this too. Well, that's all for today. I'll be back on again in a little bit. And we're back on Life in the Office. To start off this episode today, we would like to introduce the 36th President of the United States, President Lyndon Johnson. Hello, sir. How are you this evening?
I feel quite well. Thank you so much for asking. How are you?
I'm doing swell, thank you. To start off with the info, I would like to hear a little on your backstory. What your childhood was like, family, etc.
Yes, definitely. I was born in Stonewall, Texas on August 27, 1908. My parents were Samuel Eel Johnson Jr. and Rebecca Baines Johnson. I was one of 5 children, and of course I was the oldest. The town that I lived in was named after my family. I wasn't really good in school, but I did manage to graduate from Johnson City High School in 1924. Afterwards, I started going to Southwest Texas State Teachers College and did debates. When I graduated, I taught for a school for a short while, but I soon realized I wanted to go into the political field. In 1931, I won an appointment as legislative secretary to Texas Democratic Congressman Richard M. Clayburgh, and went to another place in Washington, D.C. In 1940, I met a wonderful lady named Claudia Alta Taylor. She helped me run for Congress and worked in my for many years.
Let me stop you there. Since you're getting into your later life, I have a key question. What made you want to pursue in this field?
Well, I always watched my father handling his business when I was younger because he was a politician. The older I got, the more I understood what my father was doing, and I began to like it. Remembering what I watched when I was younger helped me when I began to work in this field as well. I had very good ability to remember information. By 1960, I decided I want to be in the White House. I was running against John Kennedy, but I got to be the vice president. I did not want this position at first, but Kennedy offered it to me and I accepted. I was never really comfortable in the role as vice president, but I went towards the space programs. Most of the time, I struggled to support Kennedy's decisions. On December 22, 1963, when Kennedy got shot in Dallas, Texas, I was only 2 cars away from the shots fired. Just about 3 hours later, I was put in the seat of the 36th president. I created something called the Great Society. I knew I needed to create an action that made people forget about the loss of their president. I wanted to aid public education, provide medical care for the elderly, and eliminate poverty. When I first started the Great Society, it seemed like a success all around America. Heck, even to me. Soon, however, people started to criticize my work and expecting way more than I could handle, or even America could handle. When I could no longer control all the conflicts that were happening with the Great Society, it finally had to come to an end.
Wow, that sounded so inspirational. Your work ended up making a good mark on America. I am so thankful for that. Thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate it, and so does the audience. Well, that's all for today. I'll be back on tomorrow. To start off this episode of Life in the Office, I would like to welcome back President Lyndon Johnson here with me today. We have more to talk about when Kennedy was president and you were the vice president. I was wondering if today we could talk about Kennedy's approach to foreign policy.
Yes, of course. This subject actually is some of the reason why I didn't always support his decisions. In this foreign policy, he promoted a peaceful revolution for the countries around the world. He wanted to make this so other countries didn't ally with the Soviet Union. He wanted all America's allied countries to serve for them and help them if the Soviet Union did try to start a war with America. The Peace Corps is one of the programs that John F. Kennedy put up which sent volunteers abroad to help develop nations around the world. The first problem that arose with the Peace Corps was in Cuba. We have been worrying about Cuba for a long time, but this is the first serious problem that has ever come up. Ever since the Revolutionary War, there has been a leader that seized power in 1959. When Kennedy became president, he learned that President Eisenhower had approved a plan in 1960 in which the Central Intelligence Agency was providing military training for Cuban opponents of Castro in Guatemala.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Now let's talk about the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened during these times?
Because of what happened with Cuba. The first meeting with the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was a disaster. Germany was cut into zones. East Germany is where Berlin was located. The Soviet effort cut off access to Berlin in 1948 had failed as a result of President Truman's successful Berlin airlift. Kennedy feared that the Soviet effort in Germany was part of a larger plan to take over the rest of Europe. Mainly all the meetings Kennedy had with the Soviet Union always ended badly. When he returned home after meeting with Khrushchev in Vietnam, he decided to show the Soviets that the United States would not be intimidated. He needed more men for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. He said the United States had to be prepared. The Soviets responded by building a wall in Berlin. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of East-West conflict for the next 30 years. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union wanted to support Cuba. Photographs that were taken from the United States biplane show that the Soviet Union were putting offensive missiles on Cuban ground. Kennedy quickly started secret meetings. Kennedy was saying this seemed just like the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After talking for a couple days, Kennedy prepared his forces and televised this to tell the public about the missiles and to demand the Soviets to remove them. The Soviet Union ships were coming towards the quarantine line. We were ready to respond as soon as that line was crossed. A few days later, the Soviet leader sent Kennedy a long message which said he would remove the missiles if Kennedy promised he would remove the quarantine line and stay out of Cuba. We, of course, accepted these terms, and just like that, the crisis was over.
Oh my gosh, I knew it was scary from my end, but I would have been crying if I was someone like you. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I have appreciated all you have done for us. Well, folks, that's all for today. Make sure to tune in next time if you want to hear more about life in the office.